Welcome to the KEI's Networks series, Exploring Decarbonization, GHG Emissions to Arrest Climate Change. The focus in the second episode, is about the role of technologies, current and emerging, to address climate change. Today, we expect to learn more about mankind's capacity through technology to contain and maybe even reverse the ever-increasing GHG emissions warming the planet. Our moderator for the webinar is Eddy Isaacs. Over to you, Eddy.
Mark Summers, the Chief Strategy Officer for Emissions Reduction Alberta, responsible for the development, coordination, and implementation of key strategic initiatives, partnerships, external relation, and stakeholder engagement that demonstrates and communicates ERA's unique value proposition. We've known Mark for quite a long time, and he has been spectacular in the way he has been able to move technologies through the stages of commercialization, and the insights he provides will be superb, I'm sure. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks again, Eddy, and thanks, Perry, for giving me the opportunity to participate in today's session. I must say it's an absolute honor to share the virtual stage with these highly accomplished and highly respected intellectual powerhouses. Thanks both Oscar and Axel for setting the stage so brilliantly and diving deep into the world of nuclear power. It's always a dual benefit when I can share a bit about what we're doing at ERA, and I can learn a lot from my fellow panelists. So as Eddy mentioned, I'm Mark Summers. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Emissions Reduction Alberta, or ERA. And what I'd like to do for a few minutes before we move into the panel discussion is share a handful of examples of technology innovation projects in the areas particularly that Oscar talked about as being critical for decarbonization. I will say we don't actually have anything nuclear power related in our portfolio, either fusion or fission, but we're excited that these are indeed some opportunities and early activities in Alberta related to nuclear. And Axel, your acknowledgement slide, my first research term was in Bob Fedoseyev's lab, and so it turns out it's a small world after all. So as some context for the examples I want to share and the message I'd like to share from ERA's perspective, I'll start by giving a brief introduction of who we are and what we do. ERA is an organization based in the province of Alberta, and we were created by the government of Alberta to help the province achieve the dual purposes of achieving greenhouse gas emissions reductions and economic success. And now, as a quick aside, our inaugural first board chair when we were created in 2009 was Eric Newell, who moderated, as we know, part one of this discussion and is also on the line today. So we exist as an extension of Alberta's greenhouse gas reduction regulatory framework. In Alberta, large industrial emitters are required to reduce their emissions to a particular level. And one option to comply with that regulation is to pay money into what's now known as the TIER Fund. We end up at ERA receiving a portion of the revenue from the TIER Fund, and our mandate as an organization is to reduce emissions and support the economy by accelerating innovative technology solutions. Our role, in essence, is to share the risk of technology innovation with the private sector. So, what is it that we do? We carry out that mandate by reinvesting the revenues we're provided with to projects that advance these innovative greenhouse gas reducing technologies toward commercialization in the province of Alberta. Our focus is at the latter stages of technology readiness level. You can see on the slide here. So we primarily fund technology field pilots, or what you might call commercial demonstration projects, and in some cases, first of kind commercial deployments in Alberta. And some of the examples I'll talk about in a few minutes will represent each of these categories. Now, this model, the ERA model of using proceeds from a carbon pricing system and reinvesting a portion of those revenues into technology de-risking, is ultimately a powerful one. It allows us to take a portfolio approach across industries and across timescales, so we can help position our current industries as well as emerging industries to be competitive and sustainable in the future. So I'm just going to skip over this slide in the interest of time. And I also don't need to spend a lot of time on this because Oscar talked about this, well, primarily at the national level. But you can see here that Alberta's greenhouse gas profile is heavily industrial. We are an energy producing and an energy exporting jurisdiction. And that really comes to bear in both our greenhouse gas emissions as well as our economic productivity. So what this means is that there are some key areas we can focus on when it comes to reducing Alberta's existing greenhouse gas footprint. So the technology roadmap we've developed and we're continuing to develop reflects the scale of the challenge as well as the key focus areas we need for large-scale decarbonization. Our technology roadmap document serves as a living document, I must say, and a guide for our investment portfolio. It identifies generally 4 broad focus areas shown here, which are fairly well aligned with the opportunity space that Oscar put forward. We're now in the process of refreshing our technology roadmap to incorporate the ever-changing context and the emerging technology prospects that can enable a pathway to net zero, including things like small modular nuclear reactors, for example. So just to give you a quick sense of the breadth and scale of our portfolio, we've now invested in a total of around 220 projects. Our total investment is on the order of $820 million or so. And one of the elements of our funding is that we always require at least one-to-one matching of our dollars with private dollars. We do this to ensure that there's a sufficient market demand or at least a market opportunity for the technologies we're supporting that can be supported by the private sector and by investors. And so far, we've been very successful over the years in leveraging our dollars. The 221 projects we've invested in, $821 million, represent a total investment of around $6.6 billion. And these are Canadian dollars, by the way. So we're helping to advance significant economic activity in the province. And just quickly before I move on to the example projects, our investments are estimated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 40 megatons in the province of Alberta on a CO2 equivalent basis by 2030. And an additional 80 megatons, we estimate, based on subsequent market adoption of the technologies that we're supporting. So let's be clear, this isn't enough to get to net zero, we know that, but it's starting to become a pretty strong technology foundation for us to build on. So I want to share with you a handful of project examples from our portfolio of investments. And I just want to focus on a couple of the areas that Oscar talked about as examples of really exciting activity that's happening in some of the areas we need to focus on to start moving toward net zero emissions. So the first examples shown on this slide are around low carbon hydrogen production. Oscar talked about the importance of hydrogen already, but in summary, the allure, or one of the allures of hydrogen for deep greenhouse gas reductions, is that if the emissions can be dealt with at the point of hydrogen production, so either using renewable electricity and electrolysis or using natural gas reforming with carbon capture, you don't result in CO2 emissions with the end use or combustion of the hydrogen, which are much more distributed and harder to abate in things like vehicles, residential homes, and otherwise. So the first project shown here was publicly announced earlier this year, and this is a large-scale net zero hydrogen energy complex being developed by Air Products. This first-of-kind facility will use autothermal reforming to produce hydrogen and capture the CO2 from the reforming process at a rate of about 95%, and will feature a hydrogen-fueled electricity generation power plant, which will power the entire facility as well as export electricity to the grid and offset emissions from the grid, covering the remaining 5% of emissions that aren't captured in the CO2 capture process. A portion of the hydrogen produced in this facility will be liquefied for an output of 30 tons per day of liquid hydrogen for hydrogen fueling opportunities. The captured CO2 will be injected into the Alberta carbon trunk line for permanent sequestration. So we awarded funding earlier this year, and we're excited to see this project move forward toward construction and expected operation in 2024. The next 2 projects on this slide or in this list are both in process of being scale up from the lab scale or the bench scale up toward field testing stage. So these are much earlier in the development cycle. And these are, I don't like to talk about the colors of hydrogen so much because it ends up being confusing, but these are neither really blue hydrogen or green hydrogen. I think some people call it turquoise hydrogen. But really the concept is decarbonizing the methane molecule without steam and without an exhaust gas that contains CO2. So rather, when the hydrogen is separated from the carbon atoms, you end up with essentially pure hydrogen and a solid form of carbon in both of these cases. The first one shown here, SWR, standing wave reformers, is tackling this through what they call a wave rotor and ultimately what this does is drives a thermal cracking process. Econa Power, on the other hand, very similar concept, but uses what they call a pulsed methane pyrolysis process, which is again a similar but different thermally driven process. But in both cases, what you end up with is hydrogen and a solid carbon. Now, Econa Power, you see on the slide here, it talks about something called trigeneration pyrolysis or trigeneration. So what Econa Power is doing is they're developing a complementary technology which uses a fuel cell to convert the solid carbon into electricity and a pure stream of CO2. So in the case of Econa, if all the carbon is used in the direct carbon fuel cell, you end up ultimately with three products, which is why they call it trigeneration. You get hydrogen, you get electricity, and you get pure CO2 that can be sequestered. And so now I want to say just quickly, Oscar, I think talked about these pyrolysis type processes in one of his slides. And I think in parentheses, if I recall correctly, it talked about one of the barriers being the cost of it and expense. And so the way that Econa looks at this in particular is if they can, within the trigeneration process, if you can include the revenue in the electricity market, overall, it offsets the cost of hydrogen production in their anticipation to be quite competitive with steam methane reforming with carbon capture and storage attached, for example. So I'll leave it at that. I know time is tight. All right, the second set of examples I want to touch on is around the transport and use of hydrogen. So Oscar talked about both the supply side and the demand side. Producing hydrogen is all well and good, but if there's no market for it or no way to transport the hydrogen, then it ends up being an incomplete solution. So on the transportation side, we're excited to be working with ATCO to demonstrate the blending of hydrogen into a natural gas network. This project is demonstrating that hydrogen can be blended into a natural gas distribution system and used in customers' homes and appliances without requiring any hydrogen-specific infrastructure. Now, this is different from delivering pure hydrogen to a pure hydrogen use case, but it is a critical demonstration of the ability to transport hydrogen using existing pipeline and end-use infrastructure, at least in some configuration. The next three projects here are all about using hydrogen for transportation processes. The Azatec project, which I'm hopefully we've all heard of here, but which we funded through what we called our BEST challenge, which was announced for funding in early 2019 and is well underway, is a significant collaborative effort being led by the Alberta Motor Transport Association, who is partnered with a number of entities, including Ballard Power Systems for the fuel cell, Dana for the electric drive system, Freightliner for the glider kit, H-Tech for the refueling systems, as well as Clean Energy Solutions and the Transition Accelerator. This project will put 2 hydrogen-powered ultra heavy duty trucks on the road in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor with 2 more partners yet, Trimac and Bison Transport, who will ultimately operate the trucks between Edmonton and Calgary. The City of Edmonton project here, which will involve hydrogen-powered bus trials, and then the third one, the Canadian Pacific Railway project, which will involve hydrogen-powered locomotives, were both announced earlier this week through and awarded funding through ERA's Shovel Ready Challenge that was launched in late 2020. I see someone, Peter, I think, posted a link for the CP Rail project in the chat here. So thanks, Peter. Certainly more information available on the website than what I can show on the slides here. Now, these 2 projects, I will say, are early, not early stage technology, but early in the development process for the projects, but we can say they're making great progress already. These three are particularly powerful demonstrations for hydrogen use because they're for applications where the scale and the distance traveled and the payload requirements may not be well suited to battery-powered electrification, which Oscar talked about already. And whether these end up being the long-term winners for heavy-duty transport decarbonization, these types of trials are absolutely critical data points in assessing the potential and the promise of these solutions. Okay, so this is my second to last slide. I'm trying to not to make Perry and Eddy too nervous. We could showcase our projects for hours upon hours, but the last set of examples I want to share is around transport electrification. So again, this is more on the demand side of the electricity file. And in the first two, in particular, combined with the hydrogen project I mentioned on the last slide, will provide us collectively with a really good comparison set of transit fleet decarbonization options. Even these two alone, stripping away the hydrogen bus trial, these two electric bus projects are quite complementary to each other. The first comes from eCamion and in partnership with the City of Edmonton, and this will trial a novel power system for charge optimization at a central bus depot location. The concept here is more or less that the charging infrastructure stays in one location and the buses return to the depot for charging, and then the eCamion system ensures that the right buses receive the right amount of charge at the right time so that they can proceed with their bus routes. Now, the second project from the City of Calgary, which both of these projects were actually, both these projects were also funded through our BEST challenge announced in 2019. But the second project from the City of Calgary will trial rapid charging stations along the bus routes. Now, I happen to think that these solutions together will provide a comprehensive solution that covers a wide range of use cases. But even if I'm wrong, the data generated by these two projects will be a valuable showcase of the strengths of these different approaches. All the buses collecting together and charging at a depot, or having a number of different rapid charging stations along the busing routes, as in the City of Calgary case. Now, we have a number of other electrification on the demand side, as well as electricity generation projects on the supply side in our portfolio. So this includes, for example, an e-fleet pilot in partnership with NMAX Power, a number of renewable electricity projects, energy storage projects, and even some related to transmission and distribution systems. In fact, this is a bit of a shameless plug, but we just launched a new episode of our podcast this morning, which features TransAlta's Wind Charger project, a battery storage installation at TransAlta's Summerview Wind Farm near Pincher Creek. Our next episode will feature long duration storage. Oscar talked about the need for long duration storage technology. And our podcast is called Carbon Copy. You can get it on almost all podcast platforms, but not Spotify for some reason. I'm still planning to look into that. No, in summary though, as Oscar said, electrification and low carbon electricity will both be key pillars in Alberta's roadmap to net zero. Okay, so this is my final slide, Eddy, I promise. I want to leave everyone with a couple final thoughts around the role for technology and the need for complete solutions in order to tackle climate change and greenhouse gas reductions. And if I may, I'm going to use the COVID-19 pandemic, just like Eddy did, as a bit of a case study, building on what Eddy said in his introduction. So in fact, before COVID-19 came along, it was clear that climate change was the defining global issue of our time. And I say it will continue to be the most challenging issue we face as a global society. But COVID-19 has emerged and has dominated the public discourse over the last 2 years and has become an issue of greater urgency and acuteness compared to climate change. So my hope is that we can carry forward some of what we learned in dealing with COVID-19 into our efforts to combat climate change. The world's response to COVID-19 has been a powerful reminder of the need for aligned action, trusted leadership, and robust systems in the face of a global challenge. Technology and innovation have been applied at almost every facet, from food services to vaccines to finding new ways to host meetings and conferences just like this. For example, developing and approving a vaccine in less than a year was previously unheard of. But even with that, technology by itself was not enough to bend the curve on COVID-19 health impacts, economic impacts, and sadly, lives lost. The world needed to create new vaccines, needed to de-risk and scale up production of those vaccines, needed to unlock financing for vaccine research and development, needed to create new supply chains, implement adaptive policies, assemble the right people, and finally, build public confidence, which in some pockets of the world has been one of the greatest challenges in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic. As Eddy said, technology alone is not a panacea. And the same applies to climate change, even more so, I would say, because we need a broad suite of transformative technologies. Now, complete solutions are what we need to tackle climate change, including technology, financing, policy, people, and public confidence. And this also comes in the face of competing ideologies and competing information. And then the second lesson and my final message is a more hopeful one. And just like Oscar, I want to end on a positive note. COVID-19 has also taught us that the world is indeed capable of coordinated action and rapid technological advancements in the time of a crisis. The projects we have the opportunity to support at ERA in our portfolio are just the tip of the iceberg and a hopeful sign that complete solutions can and will emerge.
Well, Mark, I'll say, wow. It's really impressive to see how you, in Alberta, we have such a showcase of technology for hydrogen especially, both the production, the marketing, the distribution, all intended for heating and transportation. The charging station in Calgary, also very impressive. I think that the rest of Canada just does not know what is happening in Alberta. That is so, so very impressive. And thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to turn things over to Perry for the concluding session, which is really to answer any questions that have emerged. Perry, over to you.
Well, thank you, Eddy, and thank you all. I'll conclude with thank yous as we wrap this up. But beforehand, I've checked the chat and I see, Bill, you had a question of Mark regarding the actual practice and experimentation of the usage of hydrogen. Bill, do you want to pose your question?
There have been quite a few hydrogen vehicle, either fuel cell or other transport system demonstration projects over the decades throughout the world. But is there some, are there special aspects to the Alberta program, or is actually the main emphasis on trying to familiarize people that will have to deal with these systems on the long term?
You're absolutely right. Hydrogen bus trials have been done before. I think most people are aware that there were hydrogen fuel cell buses at the Vancouver Olympics, but because of the purity of hydrogen required, they had to truck hydrogen across the country from Ontario or Quebec, where it was produced with electrolysis. And so it's a little bit of both. I mean, now in 2021, the technology around fuel cells, around drivetrains, around hydrogen storage has evolved. And so it's partly a demonstration of the latest and greatest innovative technology, but it's also exactly what you said around incorporating into Alberta, incorporating into the systems of Alberta, into the psyche of Alberta, as well as testing with the local supply of hydrogen in Alberta from a feedstock perspective, purity perspective, and a systems perspective. So as a brief answer, we can certainly talk a little bit more offline, but you're absolutely right. It's both, and it kind of plays into that message around complete solutions. We need to see complete solutions, regulatory policy, know-how, and public acceptance if we want to be able to move this forward in really any jurisdiction around the world.
Thank you, Mark, and Bill, for your question. Axel, I've got one for you. You may be understating the public acceptance of nuclear, and in the case, the point being made that we're seeing more and more announcements of nuclear, and I mean nuclear in the broad sense as we know it now, France taking up more sites. China's moving in that direction. It seems to me that the social license for nuclear is in fact being revitalized.
It's hard to tell. If you look at Western Europe, it's quite divided. I think public opinion in Germany, for example, and even governmental opinion in Germany is certainly not pro-nuclear. In France, we see the government continuing to be in favor of nuclear. So I think there are still significant divisions about nuclear. And when I use the term nuclear, it's primarily focused on fission because fusion really hasn't penetrated the public awareness to a very large extent.
As you know,
yes.
I'm seeing announcements almost weekly of whether it be what's going on in England, what's happening in China, what happened in Finland. It seems every week there's some news story coming out. Well, that wasn't the case a year ago.
Whether that represents a fundamental change, I hope it represents a much more open mind to looking at issues associated with nuclear, including risks. I mean, there are risks. If you look at the risk associated with nuclear fission, I think the safety record is remarkably good, notwithstanding that there were some near misses. And that's what my table tried to show.
Okay, super. Oscar, I'll wrap up the Q&A with a question for you. Globalization itself seems to have brought science to the fore as either a new religion or something to hate. What role does diplomacy and government really play in bringing these forward? It seems to me, and I'm going to talk personally, that government seems to be playing more of a role of disrupting and impeding the emergence of new technologies than in fact expediting. And yet we talk about leadership and innovation being a fundamental platform to have an economy in the new world. And yet, well, why don't you weigh in on the social politics of climate change, the social politics of technology diffusion?
This is a very, I think this is a very important question. And there's a group of us who have been kind of frustrated with the amount of misinformation that is out there. There are very strong lobby groups by so-called experts who are really delivering the wrong message, but invariably from a very polarized point of view. So I tried to mention that in the last slide that there's a lack of understanding that when you talk about decarbonizing, in many people's minds, and this has been accentuated by a lot of political rhetoric, that basically says that decarbonizing means getting rid of the fossil fuel industry, and that's where the misinformation starts. And there's a lot of experts out there who are basically reinforcing that message in some institutes and so on. So I think a lot of this really arises from the fact that there's a lack of comprehensive integrated planning. People are coming at this from a particular position, whether it's an environmental position or a technology position and so on. But what is really required is really to get a fully integrated story together that shows that as you transform the energy system, this doesn't mean that a particular sector somehow suddenly vanishes. So I try to bring that out in the sense that we need to redefine what is the hydrocarbon at net zero. It will still be hugely important. It will have important roles. It will be still an important part of the production of electricity, because in many cases there aren't any options, and but it's going to have to require CCS and so on. But the core of your question is really critically important, and somehow we do need to say, how do we get the right story out there about the role of the hydrocarbon sector in a decarbonized net zero environment? So this is a huge challenge. I think all of us have to work together on that. And we have to get the messaging around it. We have to emphasize the importance of comprehensive integrated planning and to see what a net zero future actually looks like, including what the hydrocarbon sector would look like for a net zero future.
Eric Newell had a question.
Go ahead, Eric.
Leave it as a bit of a challenge to figure out what do we have to do to get it going, because you know, Axel raised the other very good point. You know, in the industry, the oil sands, for example, if the pilot plant's out there in 28, you're not going to even be thinking of commercializing anything till, you know, 2030. But really, that's not that far away, and we've got to start getting something going on the ground.
Mark, do you want to pick up on any comments that Eric made there?
Sure, I'll be very brief. And the only thing I'll say is that Steve McDonald, our CEO, and myself, we were at the World Petroleum Congress last week in Houston. And there was one of the technical sessions involved someone from Suncor Energy, as well as a panelist talking about the suite of small modular nuclear reactor technology coming forward, some of which Axel talked about, some of which were maybe a little bit more nuanced. And so the quick answer for me is, I mean, the philosophy of ERA is, as you very well know, is that there has to be some demand in the marketplace. And it looks like the oil sands operators are starting to get very interested in, and that the suite of technologies available with the range of steam temperature and pressure offerings coming out of the reactor is starting to look quite potentially promising for the oil sands sector. So I'll leave it at that and say it looks like momentum is going in the right direction.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Yeah.
And a couple of concluding comments or observations, if you will. With globalization, it was Bill Clinton, I think, that made the point when he visited some years ago, you are on the world stage, like it or not, with what you have with the oil sands, which is increasingly known worldwide and producing 5% of the daily production of oil in the world. We are potentially victims. And I think we're feeling it with some of the pressure that goes on worldwide. So it's critically important that Alberta get its message out. Over the last 15 years, my predecessor, the Alberta Council of Technologies and KEI through these webinars is making a point. And it was threefold. If Alberta is going to have a sustainable economy, we're going to make the impact, which we can potentially make that one, we've got to make the energy transition, which is well underway. And it's not something that we're being forced into. It's something which I'm hearing over and over again, whether it be Eddy or Eric, Oscar or Mark. We are making changes. We are adjusting, and we need to get that message out that we're not fighting for the status quo. We're fighting to accept a reality, and we are prepared to make a difference. The second point that was made is leadership and innovation, and that's what I hear Mark saying. There's plenty going on in the province of Alberta, and it's not surprising because of the pressure that we're under that we're going to adapt and we're going to make and lead in innovation. But that means getting rid of some of the red tape and the bureaucracies and the institutions that advocate for status quo. And then the final one is often been articulated as preparing our workforce for the future. And I want to modify that some way, given what Oscar just had to say. I think we've got to prepare our public for the future. The changes that are underway are potentially disruptive, whether it be climate change where we're a victim or emerging technologies where we take charge again. We need the public to be on side in a democracy, and we've got to do a better job of communicating, not about its complexity, but get our messages simple that the public can understand. So gentlemen, thank you for helping in that regard today. Eddy, in particular, your excellent moderation and preparing the panel for today. Oscar, thank you for your overview. Axel, always insightful, and I love the nuclear story, as you know. Thank you for joining us, Ellen, by the way. And Mark, I think we're in good hands.